I want to start by asking about you and about how the work that you do that's represented in this book and in several other books about race, racism, racial and ethnic identity connects to your life experiences. And what of your experiences is behind or is the driver for why you chose these topics?
That's a great question. And so I'm happy to tell you that I grew up in Bridgewater, Massachusetts, but I want to start from the really very beginning, which is 1954. I was born in 1954, and I consider that significant personally. It was the year of Brown versus Board of Education. I was born in Tallahassee, Florida, in September. Brown versus Board was in May of '54, and I tell this story because I think it situates us at a particular time. My parents were both educated at Howard University, and my father went on to earn a master's degree in the early 50s in art at the University of Iowa, which I always imagine must have been an interesting experience in the early 50s. But then he started teaching at Florida A&M, which is a historically black university in Tallahassee, and wanted to get his doctorate to advance in higher education, and wanted to do that in art education, and could have done so at Florida State University, which is also in Tallahassee, and they offered a program that was the one he was looking for, except for the fact that in 1954, Florida State was a whites-only institution. And even after Brown versus Board of Education, it was still a whites-only institution. The state of Florida, like a lot of other southern states, took their time about desegregating, but they were obligated legally because of the Supreme Court decision to provide access to graduate education. And the way they did that was to pay my father's transportation out of the state. So my dad went to Penn State, and he got his doctorate at Pennsylvania State University. So he finished in 1957, and at that point, I had an older brother who was 5 years old in 1957, and approaching school age, and my parents really did not want him to be educated in the segregated system of Florida. So my dad started looking for another job, and he found one in Massachusetts. And part of the Great Migration, moved to Bridgewater, Massachusetts, where he became the first African-American professor at Bridgewater State College, now known as Bridgewater State University. So I grew up in Bridgewater, Massachusetts, moving there in 1958 at the age of 4. And I tell that story for lots of reasons, but certainly you can see that race and racism shaped my life from the very beginning. And being one of very few black families in Bridgewater, and I was often the only black kid in my class, I went off to college with a real interest in understanding the experiences of black families in predominantly white communities. As a psychologist, I was very interested in this, mainly because I wanted to see myself represented in the literature. You know, I took a lot of classes I went to Wesleyan University in Connecticut. I took a lot of classes outside my major. I was a psychology major, but I took a lot of African American studies classes. I read a lot about the experiences of black families, but they were always about black families in urban environments or in the rural South. Mm-hmm. Nobody had written about black families in Bridgewater, Massachusetts, or communities like that. And so when I decided to go on to earn my PhD in clinical psychology and to do my dissertation, I wanted to write about the experiences of black families in predominantly white communities. And it's very easy to see that personal connection. But I got involved in the work that I do today around learning about the psychology of racism because as a graduate student, I had the opportunity to teach a course. My husband is here taking photographs. He's in the front row right here. And we got married as graduate students at the University of Michigan. We were both graduate students there, but then we moved because of a job opportunity he had to the University of California, Santa Barbara. And while I was there working on my dissertation, which was on the experiences of black families in a predominantly white community, Santa Barbara proved to be a good place to do that work. I was invited to teach a course on the psychology of racism. Actually, it was called Group Exploration of Racism. And I was 26 years old at the time. It was 1980. And I was naive enough to think to myself, how hard could that be? You know, I was familiar with facilitating groups because I was a trained clinician. At that point, I was already working as a therapist, and in fact, working at the Campus Counseling Center at UCSB, and facilitating groups on other topics. So I thought, okay, I know about racism. I've been writing about Black families. I know how to facilitate groups. I'll teach that class. And I had a very powerful learning experience as I was doing it. At the end of the semester, even though I was, relatively inexperienced, at the end of the semester, students wrote on their evaluations, and I should put this in the context of the University of California, Santa Barbara is probably the least diverse of the UC campuses. And certainly then, the Black student population was less than 2%. My classes were mostly white students. And these students wrote on their evaluations at the end of the semester things like, this course has changed my life. I think everyone should take this class. This should be a required course for everyone. And the feedback was so powerful to me as a young instructor that I thought, wow, I need to do this again. And it turned out that during the 4 years that we lived in Santa Barbara, I probably taught the course maybe 10 times. And it became, for me, sort of a signature part of my identity as an instructor. And in fact, I found it such a powerful learning experience, I decided I would rather be teaching full-time than working as a therapist. So I made a switch over. And the rest is sort of history in terms of the work that I had been doing around understanding racial identity development in the context of Black families and predominantly white communities, and also seeing the ways in which racial identity development explained student response to the material. Not just the racial identity development of students of color, of which there were always some, but the racial identity development of white students who hadn't really thought about themselves as white when they started the course, but the more they learned about racism, the more they started to recognize the way in which race was shaping their lives as well as the lives of people of color. And as that awareness started to unfold, it was quite predictable. You could sort of predict what would happen in the class if you had an understanding of identity development. And it became important to me to try to capture that understanding and share it with other instructors. So that's when I started writing much of the material that has now become part of my professional reputation, I guess.
And we're glad you did.
Thank you.
So what I want to ask you now to do is, connected with that, to think back to your college self.
Okay.
Wesleyan, correct? So to think back to your college self in Wesleyan, would she believe, did she expect that we would be further along today than we are, or would she be unsurprised?
I think that the Beverly Daniel, I wasn't Tatum yet, the Beverly Daniel of my Wesleyan years would have expected more progress. And I say that because I'm going to, again, go back to 1954, right? So in 1954, my father's having to go to Pennsylvania out of the state of Florida to get an education. In 1971, when I entered Wesleyan, there were many choices available to me, right? So that's very clear change. I can see from my parents' experience to my own a dramatic shift in opportunity and certainly thinking about, for example, voting rights. I never in my lifetime experienced any difficulty accessing the vote, right? My parents had that experience. So if you think about the milestones of my life, it was pretty much about forward movement. One of the things I talk about in my book, and I may be getting ahead of ourselves in the conversation, but one of the things I talk about in my book is that if I look at my first 20 years on the planet, it was mostly about progress, which is not to say that there weren't difficulties. One of the things that I experienced in California was housing discrimination, quite obvious. And when I sent my students teaching in California, I would give my students assignments where I would ask them to go out and collect data about, lived experiences, to go to the mall and observe things, to go to the grocery stores in different parts of the town to see what goods and services were available. One exercise that they would sometimes do would be to go out in pairs and do testing, rental testing. So, and they would come back and report regularly clear examples of housing discrimination, and I could tell my own stories about that. Mm-hmm. But this is to say, even though I encountered racism as part of my life experience, mostly I saw progress. But if you were born in 1997, I'm not sure you can say that. If you were born in 1997, you were 4 years old when 9/11 happened. And even if you don't remember that, it shaped how the society has been talking mm-hmm. about difference to a large extent. If you were born in 1997, you were 11 when the Great Recession occurred, and the anxiety about the global economy and what's happening, very different than what was happening when I was 11. If you think about being 11 in 1997, fast forward, you're 11, it's 2008. Not only is the Great Recession part of your experience, but then there's the election of President Obama for the first time, right? So on the one hand, there's that symbolic breakthrough of a black president in the White House, but immediately after his election, considerable backlash and rise in hate group participation and racial harassment, and statistics around that just really starting to rise. On the one hand, people talking about a post-racial America. Certainly that wasn't part of my growing up experience. But even as people talk about a post-racial America, we can point to instances like the shooting of Trayvon Martin. That young person who was born in 1997 would have been 15 in 2012 when that instance occurred, would have been 17 when Ferguson erupted. And all of the conversation about the shootings, the police shootings captured on video mm-hmm. of unarmed black men and women, and the conversation, if we can call it that, about Black Lives Matter, and all of that stuff in the news that we can all talk about, really being part of the coming of age climate for young people. And then, fast forward to 2016, you're 19 years old, and Donald Trump is elected president of the United States, and 20 years old, Charlottesville is happening. Those milestones, very different than the milestones I was experiencing when I was 20. And I think mine were more positive in that sense. So I had probably a more optimistic view.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned the state-sanctioned police brutality.
Yes.
And the shootings. And in this age, when that has happened, in the age of our youth today, of my son, mm-hmm. it is much more visible, I think,
much more
than in previous generations. And it felt to me like when that initially happened, when many of those things were initially captured on video and streamed on Facebook Live and posted on our news, that there was initial jarring to our system.
Yes.
And made us stop for a moment and think and talk about race. But it also now is beginning to feel, and I would love if you could tell me that I'm wrong, that it's beginning to feel like it's actually beginning to just become another part of our normative expectation for these things will happen, we will capture them on video, we will post them, but then on Monday, we will go back to not having the conversation
yes.
about race. And so that's a comment, but also a question. Do you see that, or do you think the capturing of these things on video and having it be all across the news and everywhere is in any way shaping the conversations that we might have about race in America?
I think it's shaping the conversations in some ways. You know, in my book, I talk about the impact, in the opening section of the book. I know that there are some people I'm imagining in this audience who might be familiar with the 1997 version of my book. And if you fast forward to 2017, one of the differences, there are a lot of differences in this new version, but one of the differences is this opening prologue. I called it a prologue. It's 70 pages long. So there's a lot in it, you know, reflecting about the last 20 years. But one of the things I talk about is, of course, you know, these shootings and the impact of those. And there's one of the things I write about has to do with a quote. I'm quoting a white woman writer, a blogger, who talks about, she wrote an essay about finally understanding white privilege. And she says, you know, people talk to me about white privilege and I thought it was just, you know, not worth even talking about. You know, flesh-colored Band-Aids, flesh-colored hose, the use of the, you know, that sometimes people use that as an example of privilege. And she said in her essay, I just thought those people didn't have enough to do. Do you know what I mean? That these things don't really make that much difference. This is what she's saying in her essay. She said, but then I saw the video death of Philando Castile in Minneapolis. And then she said, and then I got it. She said, I know that there's no way that would have happened to my white husband. You know, if he'd been pulled over for a broken taillight, he might have gotten a ticket, might have gotten a warning, certainly would have come home safely, would not be, you know, bleeding to death in his car seconds after the police officer arrived at the window. And so in some ways, the visibility of it makes it hard to deny the reality of differential treatment, right? At the same time, because we've seen so many of them, you do get inured to it, you know, or you can. I know, speaking for myself, there are times when I see that the video's been posted and I don't want to see it.
Yes.
You know, because it's depressing and upsetting, and how can I, you know, what can I do about it? You know, that sense of being overwhelmed. And yet, I do think that it's better to know than not know. It's better to document than not document. And to the extent that the technology has allowed us to capture things that we might not otherwise be able to show the world, has advanced the conversation in some ways.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
It certainly has moved us beyond the post-racial narrative.
Yes.
Yeah.
It has been wonderful to see that narrative die
Fall
down.
away,
Yes. It has been wonderful to see that. Thinking about the woman that you mentioned who wrote the blog.
Yeah.
And the effect that it had on her awareness. Mm-hmm. And inability to deny the racism. You write in your book about the difference between being passively racist.
Yes.
And so I will ask you to talk a little bit about that, about being passively racist. Yeah. And is it possible to be passively anti-racist?
Okay. So if you've read my book, you know the answer to that question is no. It is not possible to be passively anti-racist, but let me talk about why I say that. So in the book, there is an analogy. This analogy was in the 1997 version. Let me just say that when I was working on the updated version, I took the opportunity to talk to people who had been teaching the book, using it in their classes, and I actually hired a research firm to help me with this. And they interviewed faculty and students who had been using an earlier version of the book, not only to see sort of what needed to be added, but they also got feedback about, whatever you do, don't take this out, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the pieces of feedback I got was, keep in your analogies. And this one particular analogy was one that many people found helpful. And it's the analogy of thinking about the cycle of racism as kind of like the moving walkway at the airport, right? So if you imagine yourself at the airport stepping onto this moving walkway, and if we think about the fact that there are policies and practices that have reinforced racial hierarchies, that reinforce racism in our society. We may not be personally responsible for those policies and practices, but they're in place. And even someone who says, I don't have animosity toward other people, I don't have prejudices that I'm aware of, and I'm being intentional in saying that I'm aware of, right? Because we all have prejudices. But even somebody who says, I feel as though I am not reinforcing racism in the world, I'm trying to be, someone who embraces equity, all of that. If you are standing on a moving walkway, those systems and practices that are in place that are just sort of self-perpetuating, if you're standing on that moving walkway, some people are on that walkway and endorsing where the walkway is going, right? They're endorsing that racism. Maybe they're belonging to white supremacist groups, and they are actively walking. They're those people who are walking ahead, eager to get where that walkway is going. But there are other people who are just standing still. And those people who are just standing still may not want to go where that walkway is going, but if you're just standing still, you're going to end up there. It might not take, it'll take longer, but you're still going to end up the same place. And I think of the people who are walking fast as actively racist, but the people who are standing still as passively racist, right? Because they are also being carried along, participating in the process that that walkway represents. But if you say, okay, I'm not going to turn, I don't want to go where that walkway is going, I'm going to turn around. Unless you start moving, actively walking, you're just traveling backwards, right? And so the person who's just turning around might see themselves as passively anti-racist, but as I hope this image illustrates, they are maybe not aware because they're traveling backwards, but they're still moving in that direction. If you want to interrupt that process, if you want to interrupt the cycle, you have to be intentional and active. You have to be actively walking fast in the opposite direction in order to prevent ending up in that place.
Yes. And associated with that, you also make the distinction in your book about prejudice and then racism,
yes,
which is prejudice plus a lot more.
Yes.
If you could just tell us a little bit about that distinction.
Sure. So a lot of people, one of the things I talk about in the book, in the opening, after the prologue, in the first chapter, chapter 1, is to define the language that I'm using. And one of the things I learned in the many years I taught my course on the psychology of racism is that we don't always agree about language, but if we're not clear about how we're using it, it's very difficult to have meaningful conversation. And some people use prejudice and racist or prejudice and racism interchangeably. But in fact, prejudice, individual attitudes based on often stereotypical information, I like to say we all have prejudice, not because we want to, but because we've all been exposed to misinformation. We all get misinformation about people different from ourselves. We also get misinformation about people like ourselves. But the fact of the matter is that misinformation comes to us in the form of stereotypes. It comes to us in the form of distorted information we might learn in school or from family members and friends or the television we watch or the books we read or the jokes we hear people tell. There's lots of ways in which we are exposed to this stereotypical, prejudicial information. And because it's so pervasive, it's really unavoidable. Some people will have a heavy dose of exposure, some people will have a light dose of exposure, but we all have some exposure. And that exposure, I like to say it's like breathing smog. It's so pervasive, it's like breathing smog. And if you live in a smoggy place, you are going to be a smog breather. Nobody, no one said, let me introduce Beverly Tatum, smog breather. But we are all breathing that smog, right? If you it's hard to avoid. It's impossible to avoid. But, and I like to say, thinking about that, if you breathe in that smog, some of it is going to get in your system, right? Some of it's going to influence your lungs, and it's going to become part of who you are. And if you are breathing in smog, sometimes, not always intentionally, but often, you will occasionally find yourself having breathed some out, right? And so we all have to deal with that smog in our lives. That's what prejudice is about. Racism is more than that. Racism is not just the impact of individual attitudes, but it's also institutionalized policies and practices that have historically and continue to shape our society, how it's organized, how it's structured, the institutions we're all a part of, from how education is administered, how employment opportunities are distributed, how healthcare is received, how, you name it, everything has been influenced by those policies and practices over time. And if we think about racism as essentially prejudice plus power, that's how some people define it, prejudice combined with institutional power. I prefer another definition, which came from the work of David Wellman, a sociologist who wrote a long time ago a book called Portraits of White Racism. But he describes racism, defines it as a system of advantage based on race. And I think this is a really useful definition because a lot of people, I found when I was teaching, my students would say, I don't feel powerful. This prejudice plus power thing doesn't work for me. I don't have any power. What power do I have? But when you talk about it as a system of advantage, those policies and practices are woven together in a way that systematically advantage some people, systematically disadvantage other people. And you can use that same definition for sexism, system of advantage based on gender, classism, a system of advantage based on socioeconomic status, other isms as well, heterosexism, a system of advantage based on sexual orientation, etc. But racism, thinking about racism as a system of advantage, makes clear that if we want to dismantle racism, we have to undo systems of advantage.
Mm-hmm. And associated with undoing those systems of advantage, you make a clear distinction between our claims that we are colorblind versus the reality of being color silent.
Yes.
And so what is the difference between those two, and why does it matter so much?
Well, let me answer your question by asking a question. And I want to ask a question of this audience, actually. So let me try that. I'm going to ask the audience to raise your hand. You're not going to have to tell anybody anything. I'm just going to let you be clear about that right away. Raise your hand if you remember an early race-related memory, maybe something from childhood. Okay, a lot of hands are up, almost everybody, if not everyone. Now, the question I want to ask you is, how old were you? You think that thing you just thought of, how old were you?
6, 7, 4,
12.
Okay, so I heard 4 was the youngest number I heard. Anybody younger than 4? Okay, I got a hand here. I have one that goes back to being 3. And I heard 6s, several 6s. I heard 7, I heard 11, I heard 12. There could be other ages too. Obviously, there's lots of you in here. And if we asked each person how old, my guess is we would find a cluster somewhere around 5, 6, 7. For a lot of people, early preschool or early elementary tends to be the thing they remember first when I ask that question. So now the question is, what emotion, if any, is associated with the thing you remembered?
Anger, fear, humiliation.
Okay, so just in like 2 seconds or less, we heard shock, anger, fear, humiliation. Did I leave anything out? Confusion, yes, confusion. Sometimes people say curious, I heard that just now. Sometimes people say love or affection, because sometimes it's in the context of a caretaking relationship. But the ones we heard first are the most common. Anger, fear, shock, embarrassment, shame, humiliation, confusion, very common. And so, how many of you have experienced, oh wait, here's the last question, and that is, how many of you had a conversation with a concerned or caring adult, a teacher, a parent, grandparent, at the time of the incident? Raise your hand if you did. Okay, there's some hands up, a few, maybe a dozen. Raise your hand if you did not have that conversation. No conversation. Many more people did not. This is always the case. I ask these questions in lots of different places, and it's always the case that many more people will say they did not. Now, how many of you have experience with 4, 5, or 6-year-old children, your own or somebody else's? Okay, a lot of you have experience with that age, and tell me if I'm right about this. 4, 5, 6-year-olds are pretty candid. They tend to say what's on their minds. They don't filter much. So here we have, just in this audience, this evidence. A lot of people have an early memory with an unpleasant, an uncomfortable feeling attached to it, and most of them didn't talk to anybody about it, at an age when most people are pretty candid. That is counterintuitive, right? And so we have to ask the question, how is it that so many 4, 5, and 6-year-olds already knew not to talk about this? It wasn't that they didn't notice, they just were silent. Yeah. And were there messages in the environment that said, this is an uncomfortable subject for adults. This is something you're not supposed to talk about. This is a toxic topic. My students, over generations now of teaching, will tell me the same thing. I had an opportunity actually earlier this week to speak at a college in Rhode Island where the students, the first-year students, are all reading my book as part of a series on talking about race, gender, and power. And, you know, I was in an auditorium with 1,500 first-year students, and they had the same response. So, you know, it's not just generational. I mean, young people of today are having the same response. I think we learn at a very early age, and think about this. If you've started to learn it at 4, 5, and 6, fast forward to 20, or 30, or 40, or 60, that's a lot of years being reinforced for not speaking about something. And it's a lot of internalized taboo-ness, right? You know, I'm learning that this is, you know, many people will say, and again, this is speaking on my teaching experience, you know, when you bring students together and ask them to talk about these things, they will often say, I had knots in my stomach. I was very anxious. You know, it's like, I know I'm not supposed to do this. You're asking me to do this. This feels hard. Not to mention the fact that there's so much anger, fear, shock, humiliation, embarrassment, confusion associated with previous experiences. Yeah. There's a lot to, you know, this is the psychologist speaking, but, you know, a lot of incentive to be silent.
And so then I'll ask the psychologist, but also represented in the work that you've done,
yes,
to not leave us in that place.
Yes.
And to say, what conversations about race and ethnicity should white, Latinx, Black, Asian, Native American, and other subgroups of Americans as adults be having with each other?
Yes.
So that we can become color conscious and tell us about what it might mean to be color conscious.
Okay, so let's start with color conscious. So color conscious means you don't say, I didn't notice. You do acknowledge someone's selfhood, right? And the fact that that identity, whether that's Black, Latinx, Asian American, white, whatever it might be, is impacting their daily life, right? You know, so if someone says, I don't notice, I don't see color, what they're saying is, I'm not noticing a significant part of who you are, right? That's not helpful. Yeah. At the same, I want to tell you what, I'm coming back to your question about the dialogue in just a minute, but I wrote another book called Assimilation Blues, Black Families in a White Community, and I interviewed Black parents about raising their children in that community, and one of the parents I interviewed was telling me about a conversation he had with his child's teacher. His kid was the only black child in the class, and he was talking to the teacher about, how she would navigate that experience, help his son navigate that experience. And the teacher said, "Oh, I treat all the children the same. I'm colorblind, I treat all the children the same." And his response was, "The same as what?" And the implication being, the same as what? The same as though they're all white? My kid is not a white child in this class. He's having a different experience. And so you need to be able to acknowledge that. But coming back to the question, what should we do about our anxiety about these conversations? I'm going to say we should risk some discomfort. And engage the conversation in a way that allows us to move beyond discomfort to a healthier place. I have had the real privilege of working with teachers. An earlier part of my career, I did a lot of professional development with educators, and mostly white teachers in Massachusetts, in the greater Boston area. And what these teachers all had in common was that they worked in schools that were engaged in a voluntary desegregation program. So it was largely white teachers teaching in mostly white school districts, but districts in which black kids from Boston were being bused into these suburban districts. So I'm doing these workshops with the teachers, and they are learning how to think about how to create more inclusive learning environments for all of their students, but particularly for the students who are being bused in, the students of color. And as we're having these conversations, some of the teachers, it was part of a project that was a kind of a train-the-trainer model. So I was training teachers, and then those teachers were going to go back to their school districts and work with their peers in the schools to do more facilitation. And a graduate student of mine and I did a project where we were interested in knowing what the experience was like for these white teachers who had become peer facilitators. And they were leading these discussions in their schools. And we interviewed those teachers about how their relationships with their peers had changed, how they thought about the work they were doing, all of that. And what was really striking was that they talked about how energizing it was. Teachers kept using this word energy. I have so much more energy. And I started thinking about that from the point of view, again, of my, through the lens of psychology. Why would people have more energy as a consequence of taking on this assignment, doing this work? And it occurred to me that maybe the reason they have more energy is because we use an awful lot of energy not talking about it. Yes. Do you know that if I told you there was a big stinky elephant up here on the stage, and you all saw it, and think about this, 5- and 6-year-olds are seeing it, right? You all saw it, and then I told you, but on pain of punishment, you should not ever mention that elephant. Don't say anything about the elephant. And after a while, maybe you won't even notice the elephant's there. But just don't, keep doing what you're doing, but don't think about that elephant. It would take a lot of psychological energy, right, to get that elephant out of your mind, right? It would take a lot of energy. Or I'm going to give you another image. Let's imagine I told you there was a snake in the room, right? There's a snake slithering around these chairs. You don't know exactly where it is, but don't worry about it. Right? Don't worry about it. Just keep focused on this conversation. Don't think, you would be constantly distracted. Is it there? Where is it? I just thought of that. That's another image. Yeah. But here's the thing. We use a lot of energy not noticing this painful thing that is a part of our society. And when people say, I don't see it, that's a lot of energy not seeing what is there, right? It's a lot of energy. When you give people the opportunity to talk about it, think about it, engage with others, maybe even start to do something about it, it's like, wow, I got a lot of energy. Yes. But you don't feel that at first. The thing you feel at first is uncomfortable. And so you have to make a commitment to push past the discomfort. And I think that's part of the problem, because I can't tell you any way to do it other than feel uncomfortable at the beginning.
Yeah.
You know, when I taught my class, I used to tell my students, you are going to feel uncomfortable. In fact, you're going to feel so uncomfortable, probably around week 3 or 4, you won't want to come to class anymore. But here's the story. I'm still taking attendance. And so you have to be here.
Yes.
And, you know, by the end, you'll be saying, this course changed my life,
Yes.
right?
And you begin to see we're all still okay.
We're all
we
still
all
okay.
still have our parts and our pieces, and we are beginning to learn again after that initial period of discomfort.
Yeah.
What do you mean when you say what you say? What I mean when I say what I say?
Yes.
And we can have this conversation.
Yes.
We can feel uncomfortable about this conversation. And if we're forced to continually come back together, we can get to a point of understanding.
Exactly.
But you have to be forced to continue to come back together, because our self-protective mechanism, when we feel that discomfort, is to leave that conversation. Yes. But that also means that we left it in a moment of
at the peak
confusion.
Of discomfort.
Yes.
Yeah.
Confusion and discomfort, yes.
Let me say another word about that, if I might. You know, because there is, you know, this is a tough topic. There are a lot of things about what's happening in our nation right now that many people feel distressed about, and it can be overwhelming. And knowing that, I really wanted to end my book in a positive way. And so at the end of the book, there's this epilogue, and the epilogue is titled Signs of Hope, Sights of Progress. And in that epilogue, I lift up examples of things that individuals and communities are doing, sometimes in communities, sometimes on college and university campuses, but mostly around engaging in the dialogue. And it is, you know, you said somebody has to say, you have to come. But what is really interesting to me and exciting and encouraging are the places where communities are saying, it can be small groups of people who are coming together saying, we want to have the conversation. We know this is a necessary part of moving beyond this sickness in our society. And if we want to have healing, we have to have this conversation. And so we are going to commit to meet with each other for 6 weeks. I made that number up, but you know, for an extended period of time, knowing that the first one or the second one or the third one might feel uncomfortable, but we're making a commitment to come back again. Mm-hmm. And that commitment to keep coming in the way that you described is really important. And it can happen on a college campus, but it can also happen in a community, in a neighborhood, in somebody's house.
Yes, absolutely. And so at this point, what we wanted to do is bring you guys, our audience, into the conversation a little bit more and find out what questions you might have. I know they passed out some note cards earlier.
We have a note card over on this side. I'll be right over there.
So while that is happening and questions are coming in, I want to ask one of the questions, and just to say that I asked Dr. Tatum earlier if I could ask this question, because we're in Chicago. We can't talk about race and not talk about Obama and ask questions about Obama. And the question, so this was the only question that I asked in advance for permission, was the issue of why is it that some Black Americans feel betrayed by Obama and feel, particularly in feeling that he was not our Black president? And what might be behind that feeling?
Yeah. Well, in my book, I talk a little bit about that from the point of view of young people. And certainly, as I was just describing, right, you know, if you were born in 1997, you were 11 when President Obama was elected. And of course, there's powerful symbolism in seeing a man of African descent in the White House, his family, here he is, the most powerful person in the world. I love that photo, I'm sure many people have seen, of President Obama bending over so a little black boy can touch his hair, and that, it's like, oh, it's like mine, that moment of recognition. And in that sense, his symbolic presence, very meaningful to a lot of people, no question. At the same time, I was struck when I was working on the book, reading accounts of, for example, Ferguson and the young people who were so much a part of driving the demonstrations in Ferguson, and their upsetness with President Obama and other members of the establishment. But in particular, and you can see it from their point of view in the sense that here we have a black president, and yet we are still being shot down in the street, right? And yet we still can't get justice. Where is justice for us even when you have a black president? Unarmed black people can be shot and no one is being held accountable. That frustration, I think, that's one manifestation of that frustration. And even, I'm sure President Obama felt his own frustration around that. Certainly he made public statements about, we have to respect the rule of law, and yet I can only imagine, his own frustration about the fact that, you're in this role of significant authority, the most powerful person in the world, and yet you can't control what's happening on the streets of America in the way that maybe some people wished you could.
Yes. So one of the questions asks basically about our active efforts to increase diversity, being it gender, race, ethnicity, ability status, whatever you might say. And this question is posed in thinking about some of the articles that have come out of Silicon Valley about men. This was around gender diversity in particular, and men pushing back on that. We've seen some of those open letters that have come out. And those letters, and the argument being that there is no evidence that diversity policies or the pushing of diversity improves things. And also claiming, men claiming their rights, and that diversity efforts around gender might be pushing against their rights. You talk about this in the book in terms of backlash against affirmative action policies and things like that. So being all in that vein about when we do try to take active policies with regards to diversity, there's often a backlash associated with that. And the feeling that your diversity efforts are infringing on my rights.
Yes. So let me respond to that in a couple of ways. The first thing I want to say is that there is evidence that diverse teams outperform homogeneous ones, right? There's research on that subject. People have written books on it. We know that diversity, not just, gender, race, what some people sometimes refer to as cognitive diversity, but diversity of experience, diversity of problem solving, diversity of thought leads to more effective problem solving. If you have a team of 5 people and it's a diverse team, and you have 5 people who are of similar background and education and all those similar in lots of ways, the diverse team statistically outperforms the homogeneous team repeatedly. There's definitely research that shows that. So you can see why employers, people who are in charge of teams that are trying to do innovative things would seek out diversity. However, I also want to talk about the attitudinal piece of your question, how people feel about it. One of the reasons I had to completely rewrite my chapter on affirmative action in the book, 20 years later, the law has changed in some ways, and attitudes have changed, and there's certainly pushback against it. But here's the thing that I wanted to, that I was thinking about in the context of that question. I was thinking about something a young woman said in one of my classes. When, I taught this course on the psychology of racism, we always included the topic of affirmative action. And I asked my students to write an essay about their own view, pro or con. Do you think this is an effective policy? If so, why? If not, why not? And one young woman wrote this essay in which she said, in general, I am in favor of affirmative action, except when it comes to my jobs. And I wrote in response, which jobs have your name on them? And and I wasn't trying to be, snarky, but I was saying to her, you seem to be making an assumption. And this was a young white woman. Now, I will point out that white women have been the beneficiary of affirmative action policies. She didn't seem to see it. I mean, she wasn't thinking about herself as a beneficiary of affirmative action. But she was assuming that if there was a job that she applied for, that she was well qualified for, it was, quote, her job. Mm-hmm. And I think that part of the challenge, and it's not always, I don't think people always recognize this, but if someone has deeply internalized white supremacy, if that is part of what they've internalized, and the story ends differently, the white guy doesn't get the job. If they've deeply internalized the hierarchical nature of white male patriarchy, right? If someone has deeply internalized that and it doesn't work out that way, then it might feel as though something has gone awry. As opposed to assuming that that person must really be good, and that's the challenge. I mean, so a long time ago, back in the early 80s, I read an essay written by an author, if I'm remembering correctly, a writer named David Bradley, an African-American writer named David Bradley, and he wrote about the double-edged sword of affirmative action. On the one hand, he acknowledged that he'd been the beneficiary of affirmative action. On the other hand, he was frustrated by that because it allowed his white colleagues they never had to come to terms with the fact that he was better at something than they were, right? Mm-hmm. They could always say, oh, he's just here because of affirmative action, as opposed to he's really good at that, right? And that is the double-edged sword. But I think that idea, and it's represented, I'm expanding on this a little bit, but it's represented in recent survey results. You maybe have heard on NPR and other places that there have been a number of polls, I cite some in my book, where white people, young and old, have said that discrimination against white people has become as much a problem as it is against people of color. And when you read that data, if you're familiar with any of the indicators, you have to say, where is this coming from, right? There is no, if you look at employment discrimination data, if you look at education access, if you look at healthcare, whatever your indicator is, white people are still systematically advantaged. So where is this idea that discrimination against white people is so rampant? And I really think it has to do with this notion that sometimes, and the election of President Obama speaks to it, right? We've all seen a movie that goes like this. There's a white hero in the movie, and maybe there's a black character in the movie, or the good guy and the bad guy. Often the good guy is represented by the white person, the bad guy by the dark-skinned person, and there's a struggle, and in the end, the white guy wins. And usually the black character, if there is one, is eliminated earlier on in the movie. And have you seen that movie? and so, we've all grown up with that narrative. And then if you have a narrative, and if you think about the first election, 2008, as being like that, you've got this unlikely character, black character, and there's a struggle, and in the end, the white guy's supposed to win, except it didn't work out that way, mm-hmm. right? And that is a shift, and that's a paradigm shift. And when our deeply held assumptions are disrupted, as they were in that election, and they might be when we see somebody we don't think is going to be the person gets hired. When our assumptions are disrupted in that way, it is unsettling, and it leads to faulty reasoning.
Yes.
We see a lot of evidence of that.
Yes. So this is taking on that challenge of asking a very uncomfortable question.
Okay.
I'm going to rephrase the question just a little bit. So the question is about the N-word. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to ask you to think about it in the sense of, well, I know how you will think about it, but so,
Okay, so
but put the preface of, we're talking about identity.
Yes.
In many ways. So the question is basically asking, how does the definition and the use of the N-word differ when Black youth might use it among themselves, mm-hmm. And still absolutely do not approve of a white individual attempting to then use the N-word?
Okay, so I have a couple of things to say. I'm going to be very, the first thing is, I grew up, some of this is generational, right? I grew up in a world where you never used it in any form and shouldn't allow other people to use it in any form around you. That was what I learned in my house, right? And I personally don't like to hear young people use it. Now, they will say, the N-word has different endings. Mm-hmm. There's the N-word that ends ER, and that word is, always an insult. And then there is the use that some people use the word where it ends in an A. And that is often used among African Americans as a form of endearment sometimes, mm-hmm. or, just a way to connect. Mm-hmm. And people talk about, as I'm sure you know, and the audience may as well, people talk about reclaiming the word, taking it back, taking the power out of it. And still, a word that should only be used within groups, not across groups, right? But I heard someone say this in a way that really helped make it clear. I was talking to a teacher who was trying to explain this to adolescents who usually don't get it, right? They're like confused by it. White adolescents will be like, well, my friend uses it, how come I can't, And it has everything to do with, sort of being in a group and outside a group. And this teacher gave an explanation that I thought was really useful. And he said, there are things that your mother calls you. Pet names, mm-hmm. family names, things that, within that family community, people can use, but you wouldn't allow anybody else to call you that, right? And while it's not quite the same thing, that notion of in-group and out-group is part of helping young people understand that. Though, as the mother of 2 young men, don't use it in my house.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your questions. Thank you.